Welcome to Beanstalk, M&J's podcast where we are sharing and showcasing our areas of expertise through conversations with practice leaders on their knowledge and experience. If you were tasked with optimizing a state or local government, where would you start? Human resources, essential services, budget, technology? In today's episode, we are going to unpack the blueprint for a modern, high-performing government. And I'm very excited to be joined by our guest, David Roberts, who is the practice leader for our management consulting and government advisory services segment. Hey, David.
Hey, Brandon. It's great to be here.
So David, I kind of gave the introduction of trying to optimize a government, and I'm really excited for you to be joining to this episode because of your background and experience and expertise in government operations and all things government. So will you do a favor for our audience and just kind of give me a little bit of a background on yourself and your role at Malden & Jenkins?
Yeah, absolutely. So David Roberts, probably been with the firm for over 6 years now. And I have 25 years experience focusing strictly on state and local government. And that's in the consulting realm. And so we do a wide variety of things, but it's really about problem solving and helping create positive transformation.
Well, and that's, it's awesome that he's focused on the government space because, one thing I always think about when it comes to governments is we all think about and interact with governments in different ways, just as, citizens and residents. But really, when you break it down, like governments, they have a business to run just like anybody else, right?
Absolutely.
So they have to just, really focus on a lot of the core things that throughout this podcast series, we kind of navigate and view on. All of those are highly relevant topics for governments. But there are some special things. I mean, they are unique in a lot of aspects too. So you really have to kind of understand the space, specifically and kind of treat them for what they are. So from that perspective, I guess, can you just kind of talk me through from kind of a high level some of the overarching things you think about when it comes to kind of governments or activities and helping them kind of optimize and serve their missions and efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously with governments, there are core services that they have to provide. And I think that, when governments focus internally on how they're providing those services, they're able to do them more efficiently and effectively. And I think with that results in either additional services or enhanced services that are being able to be provided to the citizens and stakeholders.
Yeah, definitely, because that's a lot of the times when we look to our governments, it is just the services and they're not just services, essential services.
That's
in many ways,
great point.
Things where we're reliant on, and I know budget can always be something they need to navigate and keep a close eye on. But at the end of the day, like they have to provide those services regardless of budget in many cases, right?
You're absolutely right.
So I want to kind of dive into services, but even just bigger picture too. I guess, I'm thinking like human resources and optimization and business processes. Like kind of what are the themes that you mainly think about when it comes to kind of governments and their operations?
No, you're exactly right. I think really there's kind of 5 key themes that should be focused on for efficient government operations. The first is your human capital. And then maybe we can dive into each of these individually. But the second would be service delivery model. How is the government providing its service to its citizens and stakeholders? Third would be the business processes or workflow. So what are the internal processes that the government's using to deliver its services? 4 would be innovation and technology, helping ensure that the governments are staying current, staying relevant, and also with that comes security as well. And lastly, customer service. I think that's often something that's not necessarily thought about, but really understanding who the customer is, and that's both external, your citizens and stakeholders, as well as internal. There are many support functions within the governments that provide internal services.
Oh, yeah, those themes. And that's something, I guess, it's nice too, because I feel like my intuition was right then, when it comes to thinking about a government and that they have a business to run and a lot of the things they navigate, because those themes you just outlined. So with the human resources, definitely agree, monitoring our workforces, the services they're offering, and their delivery models around that, and then the business processes. technology, and then customer service. So those 5 themes are perfect. I would love to navigate each of those with you. So kind of walking through that journey of those themes. I guess let's start on the first one you mentioned, which is human resources. I know that's just a common thing business leaders everywhere has to navigate and monitor. But from a government lens, what are some of the key things that governments need to pay attention to when it comes to kind of human capital and human resources?
No, that's great question. And I think that human capital is one of the biggest, areas that governments should focus on. Especially when you look at expenditures, it's always the largest line item. And so I think that, human capital, obviously it's the largest line item from an expense perspective, but also is the government's greatest asset. And so how can governments maximize its greatest asset? And I think that gets into training and equipping employees. There's a great little quip that I love to share. A CFO walks into a human resources director's office, and the CFO says, "Well, what if we spend all this money training and they leave?" And the HR director says, "Well, what if we don't train them and they stay?" And so I think that that speaks volumes. That really should be investment in people. And I think that looking at the human capital perspective, it gets into employee culture, the work environment, and really you want employees, or you want governments to focus on the 3 R's. So it's recruiting, retaining, and retirement. So you want to focus on attracting top talent to your organization. Then once they're there, you want to do the things you need to do to keep them, and then hopefully evolve all the way through retirement and keep them there for a long period of time.
Yeah, well, and that's a funny quip you had about the train, but that is so true, though, especially when you're looking at an organization, because all different types of businesses, different business models have different kind of, if you look at their financial statements, different kind of costs, and if you think about like a factory or something and all the different fixed costs they have and the production facilities and whatnot. When it comes to really service-oriented organizations, it is personnel, it is the human capital, that is primarily where the money goes, and so investing in that appropriately. So I love how you described kind of the first thing is, well, just the training, and also maybe even today upskilling when it comes to technologies. So double click on that a little bit. I guess, what does training kind of look like? Are we talking about, a lot of internal training and our onboarding processes and kind of the life cycle of an employee? Are we more focused on like external conferences and thought leadership avenues? Are we just beefing up standard operating procedure manuals to kind of be a handoff? What from like a best in breed government, I guess, what does kind of a good training culture look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is really all the above. However, that being said, I think that there certainly needs to be internal training. And also there's some things that can be done a little bit different, such as job shadowing, or even sending employees to do other jobs that are outside their department and role, so that they can better understand departments and better understand the enterprise goals and objectives.
That kind of ties into communication too, right? Like when it comes to businesses, just having open channels of communication, understanding what one another does, and being able to work together and have that kind of cross-divisional and cross-department support. I love that idea of having them, giving everybody an opportunity just to kind of step over into that office over there and see what they're up to, and then have them kind of return. That's really neat. And job shadowing as well. Love that idea. Great concept. Now, what about when it comes to that retention thing that you mentioned? I know, just generally speaking, when it comes to the workforce and different trends and different, areas of expertise and different subject matters, sometimes it can be kind of challenging to not only first attract the right talent, but then also retain them. What are some of the things that you look at from the perspectives of attracting and then importantly retaining that talent? Like how can we do that at a best-in-breed government?
Oh, absolutely. So I think a key to retention is creating that positive employee culture and work environment. And I've looked at numerous surveys, and what's important to employees, especially younger generations, really is having, one, a defined career ladder and a career path, and second, having constant communication really through mentoring relationships. And so survey data says that people really want to know that their organization is invested in them. And I think that, if you can build formal succession plans, and I've spoken on this topic a lot, it really helps to motivate staff to know that they may be groomed for a certain role or position, or maybe have the opportunity to do some stretch assignments. And so I think showing that investment in people, and having that constant communication and really clear defined career path, will contribute significantly to people staying.
That career path, like it starts with a defined career path. And then from there, showing somebody how they can walk that. And then through the mentoring and other things, really, giving them the opportunity to progress through that career path. So yeah, that's a great call out. And now what about when it comes to just these days, remote work's becoming more and more common, hybrid work, arrangements. Some organizations are, really fully in office, and there's kind of a lot of different variety, and something about a lot of our kind of commercial enterprises, especially, is they often kind of pick their locations based off of what best serves their operating model. Whether they want to be a little bit more remote, be a little more hybrid, they can kind of pick the right geography for that. Whereas a government, they are where they are, in a lot of cases, whether it's a big metropolitan area or a more rural, part of a state. How are you seeing kind of the human capital side of things throughout all different types and shapes and sizes of governments when it comes to like remote work versus on-site? How are they navigating that?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question, and I've been pretty fascinated to see how different organizations do that. And obviously, the COVID pandemic kind of spurred a lot of this stuff in terms of remote work. I think that, as a culture and society, remote work has become very common. There are still some governments that, require people to come in the office 5 days a week. And I think that those organizations have some difficulties in terms of attracting and retaining talent. But what I've seen majority is that a number of organizations do offer hybrid schedules or flexible schedules. And I think the importance with remote work is just ensuring that constant communication. Generally speaking, people are able to do their jobs, with a laptop and have access to the tools. So performance can still be monitored from an output perspective. But I think just ensuring that you have those formal touch points, especially as a team. It's important that if you do have a remote worker, that they really feel connected and not like they're sitting on an island.
Right. Yeah. And, we talked a lot about just the services too of a government, just ensuring that whatever operating model we have and arrangements with our employees, that we're delivering the services. And from that sense, I kind of want to start getting into the next theme that you outlined, which is, service delivery.
Absolutely.
And so, that kind of makes me think too, tying the two together, just like the, offshoring versus onshoring, or in-house versus contracting out, or, our employees versus contractors, just the different types of arrangements you see in the business world in terms of leveraging our people, and then also kind of, coordinating and having some other resources available to us when and where necessary. What does that typically look like in the government space? Are they typically doing it all in-house, or are there oftentimes contractual relationships they have with outside parties? What's kind of some best practices there?
Yeah, I think I'm a firm believer that, government should focus on government. And obviously with that comes a large amount of support services needed to do that. But I think if the, organization as a whole can really focus on its direct services, and where possible leverage outside expertise to fill some of those roles, such as, custodial, fleet maintenance, things of that nature. So you do have a hybrid in terms of many governments performing all services internally. You do have governments that do more of a mixed bag. And you also have some smaller governments that largely outsource a lot of their operations to private companies.
That makes sense. So the kind of the common kind of default state would be a lot of the services we were offering as a government, our in-house people, our employees, we're really doing that. And for some like administrative tasks, oftentimes that's where maybe some more like some finance-oriented functions or, different types of consulting arrangements, that kind of stuff, look to the outside for that. That makes sense. Now, what about like the concepts of like, centralization, decentralization? Kind of talk me through some of those and how that relates to government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of the debate between centralization and decentralization has been going on for a while, and it predominantly relates to back office services. So I'd say specifically within finance and HR. And so there certainly are pros and cons to centralization and decentralization, but from an efficiency and from a standardization and from a governance perspective, I think it's better to have a more centralized model. Just kind of giving you a couple of examples, you may have a centralized HR where all the functions are contained within the HR department, and the HR department governs HR policies and procedures for other departments. And within HR, you may have liaisons, but all those people report to the HR director. In a decentralized model, you may have HR, but then you may have individual people within each department that are responsible for HR tasks, but they report up to the department director. And so with that, again, pros and cons. Pros may be that you have direct access in a department when you decentralize, but a con would be that you really have less standardization and less enforcement over enterprise governance.
So the reporting lines is really kind of where some of the big differences happens. I imagine that that's pretty common in technology too, like IT, kind of a centralized government-wide information technology department. But technology is very important for every individual department. So I can see them also having their own IT resources. But then what are the reporting lines? Does the IT person in finance report to the lead of finance? Or does the IT person in finance report to the lead of government-wide IT?
That's right.
Right?
That's right. Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah. I can definitely see how that can apply to a lot of different functions throughout the government. And then that just kind of applies these bigger picture things about centralization versus decentralization. And so I guess the best practice we want to work toward is an element of like healthy centralization, just to, as you said, have consistent policies, consistent practices. We're all following the same playbook.
Right.
What we're doing is institutionalized in our government, as part of our culture. But there is an opportunity for them to, be able to serve a particular department's needs when and where they're different than others.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Now, how does that play into kind of the next thing you talked about too was business processes?
Yeah.
We're kind of getting into just different departments and their unique ways of operating, but we want to have standardization where practical. So I guess from a business process perspective, how can we best equip our government?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think what we've seen from an industry trend has really related to use of automation and even the use of AI. And so my definition of a business process is a workflow or end-to-end, step-by-step process flow of accomplishing a common objective. And so with that, you really need to look at who are all the players, who are the stakeholders, what are all the dependencies and touch points that may flow from this process flow. And so I think the goal really is to ensure that you can provide whatever objective you're looking to as efficiently and effective as possible. And I think that automation certainly has helped. There still are a number of governments that heavily leverage paper. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's more prone to human error. Mm-hmm. And so the more automation, the more use of technology for workflows, the better. And I think also it drives not only consistency, but drives accountability in terms of having, automatic approvals, the approvals may be, saved so you can go back from a compliance perspective. And so there's lots of benefits to automation.
Yeah, well, that's folks who follow this podcast series know that Brandon loves to try and solve problems with technology. So I really appreciate that when we're talking business process, you're focused on automation, because that's something too when it comes to software automation, especially. I know a lot of our listeners who have listened to our series, it's how we've talked about software automation being taking a business process and breaking it down into tasks, and then seeing how those tasks can be done by some type of software, and then stringing those softwares together so each task after task after task is performed by some type of software automation to where now the whole business process is. And so I can definitely understand how in the business world, that's something that when it comes, margins of the focus, there's always a big opportunity for there and efficiencies. But in government as well, just to optimize our practice. And it's not just the perspective of trying to improve a margin. Like you said, it reduces the opportunities for error.
That's right.
And then sometimes, too, it does give us a good sort of audit log, per se, like you talked about for the approvals, because it's all electronic. It's all there in the record. You can go back and see, which when we have good controls, good records around such things, it just protects all of us.
That's exactly right. And I think automation, certainly when done correctly, is very much a value-added benefit. And for the people that's, worry about automation taking their jobs, I really haven't seen that. What I have seen is the use of automation freeing up people's time so that they can do more value-added roles and responsibilities as opposed to just kind of rote tasks. And I think another quip for you, the ATM didn't replace the bank teller. They're still there, right? They're doing more value-added things today.
Exactly. Usually the best candidates for software automation from a process perspective are the boring process.
That's right. That's exactly right.
In my experience.
For sure.
Well, I guess, are there any kind of, common processes you've come across that, are really kind of common areas of inefficiencies you've seen at different governments?
Yeah. So I think, if you've heard me kind of present before, finance and HR are dear to my heart, because I think that every decision has a fiscal impact and every decision has a people impact. And so from a finance perspective with automation, I've seen a lot with accounts payables. So in terms of, receiving invoices, paying invoices, having the automatic workflow, and really not passing paper from department to department, requesting approvals makes a big difference.
Yeah, definitely. Just kind of how our vendors and suppliers are providing us invoices, having a good kind of incoming channel for that in an automated fashion, and then kind of propping those up for coding and review and approval, and pass them across departments, and then getting them into our accounting system, recorded and posted, and then routing them all the way through to the disbursement process to where maybe we can even get to electronic process. So from the moment a vendor or supplier sends us an invoice until we're ready to have the outflow of resources, an entire electronic automated process that goes through proper coding, approval, and documentation. Is that kind of what you're envisioning?
Exactly
and seeing at some of the best in government? Yeah, I agree. That's an awesome candidate. Yeah, for automation.
And there's even the use of AI within that in terms of doing initial scans and ensuring that vendor invoices have all the proper information that's required. And so I think I see AI as an accelerator, not necessarily something to fully rely on, but it accelerates the process and it brings exceptions to the user.
Well, especially when we have a budget to follow.
That's right.
And we have procurement policies in place. And so that's something too that technologies, earlier you mentioned can, to the extent we can use technology correctly, it can reduce opportunities for human error, because those are areas where it can be hard to make sure we're doing everything we need to be doing from all those perspectives, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think just going back to the two examples within human resources, often a person's initial touch point may be through the recruiting process, and leveraging automation to help with submitting applications, submitting resumes, things of that nature, is really important. And I think not only is it more efficient, but it provides a positive first impression.
Yeah, absolutely. But our employees still have their place.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, the bank teller's still there.
Exactly.
Now, what about just other, like, are you seeing any trends or kind of emerging technologies or anything that, government should make sure to pay attention to? Or maybe it's just, you've been talking about AI. Maybe the answer to that question is just AI. But,
Right.
but I guess, from your perspective, is it AI what do governments need to make sure they're keeping a pulse on from a tech perspective?
So I think two things. And I think one, certainly, the attitude and willingness to, ensure that governments are being aware of current trends, which certainly is, AI is one of those. But I think with that comes responsibility. And so it's really having the right IT governance throughout the organization to ensure that AI is being used either consistently and within defined parameters.
Yeah, because that's definitely, when we're talking about technologies like AI that are just inherently data technologies, we need to have good data governance.
Without a doubt.
And I think that's especially true when it comes to governments, because I know the governments that I rely on day after day, like, they have a lot of my information. I entrust a lot to them, and they realize that. But to the extent they're leveraging these technologies, I appreciate that you're advising them to keep an eye on things like privacy and security and just all the different data governance considerations.
Without a doubt.
Now, and that also ties into on the front end when we're talking about kind of human capital, human resources, training, upskilling. You mentioned monitoring trends. I think that's probably just something where these two things tie together, of just how are we empowering our people to make sure they're out there keeping tabs on what's happening.
That's exactly right.
And talking to people like you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Brandon. I think that kind of goes back to that employee culture and really positive tone at the top to really encourage and foster innovation. And I think that, whether it's through additional training or kind of self-discovery, there really needs to be that environment where people want to be leaders and new adopters of emerging technology. A lot of governments take the position that we want to wait and see, and we'll kind of let the private sector figure it out, and then we'll adopt it. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But I think each government needs to really have an open mind and an investment when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of cases, the technology is there. It is proven. It's out there. It's just kind of being creative on how can we kind of reconfigure, repurpose it to apply to us.
That's right.
And from that lens, I guess when it comes to looking into a new technology, whether it's an emerging fancy technology like AI, or even just something that we're all relying on, like our ERP system,
Sure.
I guess, are there best practices that you encourage governments to navigate in terms of kind of seeing what's on the market and bringing in the right tool for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of governments think that a new ERP is going to solve all their problems. And, certainly ERPs have different abilities to be configured, or not as much if they're cloud-based. But I think the important thing is to really define your business requirements and your business needs before going out and soliciting an ERP. You want your technology to work for you. You don't want to work for your technology. And so I think doing the upfront legwork is a key to really finding the right solution.
So it's not just hearing the best sales pitch.
Not at all. And there's some good ones out there.
There are some good ones out there. And we all know every demo, like, everything looks like it worked perfectly. Right?
Without a doubt.
So I like that. So kind of step one is it sounds like really identifying and clarifying our business requirements. What do we need from this system? Then looking at the different systems that are out there, and then hearing the sales pitches and kind of aligning them to ours. And then, I guess anytime we're looking through something, change management comes to play too. So I imagine we need to kind of pull out some best practices from the playbook on things like change management and project management.
Without a doubt. I think, unfortunately, change management is something that often gets cut from the budget. And it's, in my opinion, one of the most critical aspects to an implementation. Yeah. So ensuring that you've got the right change management, you've got project champions, you have the right project managers, are all crucial.
Absolutely. Perfect. Love it. Now, I also wanted to talk to you, David, about just like kind of the customer service side of things. When we think about our governments and the essential services that they're offering, we're citizens, we're residents, but we're also customers.
That's right.
So is that something that governments you work with, do they think in those terms?
I think the more progressive or the more leading governments certainly do. And, with that, they've taken a lens of, trying to understand the customer experience. So really, how does somebody go about getting a building permit? How does somebody go about paying their water bill? How easy is it? How secure is it? How efficient? And so I think that leading governments have really tried to balance efficiency with providing exceptional customer service. And speaking of customer service, my perspective is that there's really two lenses. You have certainly your external customers, and so those are your citizens, your stakeholders, your users. But then you also have internal customers. So, somebody in HR or finance is cutting paychecks or helping to process payroll, and somebody in purchasing is, buying goods and services for the organization. So you have internal customers as well, which I think are just as important as the external.
Well, as you're talking through it, it just kind of made me realize that everything we've been talking about is kind of leading to customer service, from the training and upskilling of our people to the business processes we have and interdepartmental, kind of structures and channels of communication. The technologies we have brought in and implemented, all kind of leads to that smooth customer experience. Because as you said, a customer is not just somebody outside the organization, it's also the department next door.
That's exactly right.
Now, have you encountered like any common barriers to smooth services or accessibility or anything of that nature?
So I think, certainly resources and funding can contribute to that. But I think and you're exactly right. All the things that we're talking about kind of go together. What I've seen is, unfortunately, lack of training, lack of specifically customer service training and de-escalation training. I think all those things are really important when dealing with the public that can help ensure a smooth transition, but yet don't always occur.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, this has been a fantastic conversation. I guess before I let you go, any last thoughts you have on just kind of a key thing for the leaders of governments to have top of mind, or trends you're seeing out there, or just kind of any last thoughts you have for our audience?
Yeah, I think, key thing is really don't be afraid to fail. There's a lot of proven things out there that, may work for some organizations, but may not specifically work for yours. And make sure that you're taking the time and effort to really tailor it to your needs. In order to be successful, there's going to be some trips and some bumps, and that's okay. As long as we're focused on a common goal, governments continue to thrive and not only provide those essential services, but provide them well.
Well, and that can be a hard posture to have, to not be afraid to fail when we are a very public role. We don't really fail in private, but we have to, though. You're right. We have to try, we have to experiment, we have to push a little bit, and I think, so long as everyone knows we're working toward having just an efficiently well operating government, then, they'll give us some grace. So David Roberts, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you have any follow-up questions about the considerations we discussed today, or any other financial or business considerations you're navigating, please don't hesitate to contact us at www.mjcpa.com.